Yeah, thank you for having me in this conference, and I'm really excited to continue the dialogue of masks because I've been thinking about them a lot in the context of a project I've been doing on the history of clothing and crime. So I kind of wanted to bring that into the debate, and I'm also had a longstanding interest in medical issues in fashion as well, disease and dress. So it's great to be able to share this. Okay, I'll try and get my screen. There we go. Okay, let me share my screen. All right. So hopefully you can see this now.
Yeah, all good.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll start with this. Many cultures and eras have masked the face in the context of ritual, performance, and defense. This paper explores some of the other occupational and aesthetic contexts for masks, from their association with criminal disguise to the way in which they have swiftly gone viral, so to speak, as fashionable protective accessories across the world today during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm also really interested in their materiality. What have masks been made of, and how have they been produced? How do they differ in their functions, design, and reception? And the contrast that strikes me in researching this is between masks that are very makeshift and kind of made of whatever's available versus the masks that are carefully engineered for specific purposes. The bodies that wear them in a range of historical and cultural contexts also influence mask wearing practices. And I conclude this brief talk, which is part of, as I mentioned, a larger research project into the history of clothing and crime, by opening a dialogue about what I would call mask privilege, which we've sort of started talking about, which means that, of course, many people, including African-American men, do not feel safe wearing masks because of longer histories of anti-Black racism and the association of masks with criminality, concealment, and threat in Western culture. So the criminal mask, and I'll talk about, okay, so what I'm gonna look at kind of is talk about crime a little bit, and some of the materials that have been used have been black crepe, or crepe as it was spelled, which is also the fabric used in mourning, which is interesting, and also things like stockings, so things that are fabrics that are happen to be stretchy, breathable, and often kind of don't reflect light. And then I'll also look at the history of disease, and it's really interesting how long a history this mask was designed by a Chinese doctor, the little icon that I'm showing you, during the Manchurian plague, so-called, in 1911. So there's a long history of kind of the mask to protect against epidemic disease, and again, using what's available. So this white, hygienic, these are just bandages gauze bandages wrapped around the face and like the nose and mouth, or later pale blue or green fabrics in the surgical settings, for example. And then of course the fashion mask, which I won't treat too much today, but again, using what's available, these offcuts and scraps in cheerful patterns and colors to offset ideas of threat and danger. Oops, sorry, I meant to go forward. Okay, so what are some of these masks? These are some of the ones I'm researching on the left in the Scotland Yard Crime Museum, and the criminal mask itself has provoked deep suspicions of facial coverings for several centuries. It's been largely fashioned of dull, unreflective dark cloth and used to prevent the identification of the individual wearing it. The much more recent white or light-colored medical mask began to emerge in the early 20th century alongside new scientific understandings of germ theory, aseptic surgery, and the spread of epidemic disease. And again, Wu Liande, this doctor, kind of developed this so-called anti-plague or gauze mask. There were lots of different design ideas at the time. And this is when, sorry, I'll go back. This is when covering the mouth and eventually the nose took on protective healing connotations. And finally, there's the very recent advent of the fashionable non-medical cloth mask in cheery colors and patterns, which serves more to protect others and to display one's communitarian values. And yet it's very interesting that they're still using this military language of the sewing army, I think is very telling here. Okay, and then in contrast to those perhaps more makeshift masks, there are also these sort of complex and strategic technologies that are used to mask and shield the face, including PPE. Again, it's not called fashion or dress, it's equipment, which has military connotations, in hospitals, including face shields, and of course, unfortunately, on all of our screens recently, police tactical or riot gear. Again, it's not clothing or dress, it's gear. which again has military connotations. So again, things to explore. But you have the kind of personal protective equipment that shields against sort of invisible viral threats. And this is sort of the modern uniform of the healer. And then you have the tactical or riot gear to shield against supposedly visible physical threats. But it also confuses the identification of police as threatening and potentially violent individuals. So you can't distinguish one from the other very easily when they're wearing this equipment, which is a problem in healing settings. And of course, you have people wearing pictures of themselves to show themselves without the PPE. But in a police situation, you don't want that. And that goes back to a longer and larger history of kind of how the state has used facial features and measurements to identify people, including I'm just showing you kind of, most of you may know of Alphonse Bertillon, who in the late 19th century worked for the Paris police and standardized the mugshot, in which you have to have the front and profile view of the face clearly visible for this system of identification to work. And then I've been personally studying how masks have been used in trial settings, and I found this very recently, but this is a case of a bank robbery in Montreal in 1924, and this is the press reporting on the trial, in which a lot of money was, there were deaths, money was stolen, but they put one of the masks that was found and the pieces of fabric it was cut from in a double-sided frame to show it to the jury as an exhibit. And crazily, the Crown prosecutor also appears wearing one of the other masks as well during the trial. So it's interesting how these masks have been used in a kind of trial setting. So I just wanted to share too some of the trends I'm finding, if you like, and that in the 17th and 18th century, masks were most often used for highway robbery, so people being robbed on the streets. They were made out of black crepe for the most part. These two men were sentenced to death, and it describes how another observer talks about how Morgan and Dupuis, those were the suspects, loaded their pistols, and Morgan borrowed 3 or 4 pins of the gentlewoman of the house to pin their crepes with into their hats. What do you mean by crepes? The witness responds that they had over their faces when they robbed to conceal. And I'm showing you a picture of early 19th century crepe because it was a very stretchy and in some ways breathable, cheap wool fabric. And then in the 19th century, it's most often appearing in as something used in a context of housebreaking or burglary. You can see the penalties in 1862 for these 3 suspects was penal servitude, imprisonment rather than death. But the housemaid in this case testifies, "I had not time to notice the man much. It was a tall man who was over my mistress, and I heard him say that if she screamed, he would murder her. They both had black masks. I think they were crepe. They covered the eyes and below the mouth and quite obscured their faces." And so this idea of concealing your face, and this is an image from an 1866 kind of serial narrative called The Wild Boys of London, about young gangs of boys who would break in and commit crimes. So here he's wearing a mask. And then finally, in the early 20th century, you start to see kind of things like bank robberies, and lots of masks start being made out of stockings. And often this leads people back to the stockings that they've been cut from. And you can see they're very makeshift, like it's just a piece of stocking cut out kind of crudely with ties, or just, kind of whatever was available. So yeah, so that's a very, very brief kind of history of some of the uses of masks in crime. And then in disease, we're familiar with, I think it's interesting to think about the nose and scent and disease, and how miasmatic disease theories meant that you wanted things to smell pleasant, so you'd have this beak with perfume in it to protect you, and accessories with perfume. And even up into the 1930s, people didn't cover the nose. They didn't think of the nose so much as a problem as the mouth. So here's some young nurses in 1908 with only their mouths covered. And then finally, we have this kind of progression, this technology kind of moving from these gauze masks made with gauze that's available in the field to medical professionals, to a full-on 3M medical N95 mask, which obviously there were supply problems with and possibly still are. And then I guess I would conclude that the final category of mask, the non-medical cloth mask, has become widespread only in the last few months of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course. But as the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests prove, historical inequities and injustices in the health and treatment of Black and Brown people continue to haunt North American society. One of the thoughts that I'm mulling over, and which Aaron Thomas's article in the Boston Globe, which I have here, is that it's still not possible for all bodies to feel safe wearing masks. His headline is "Why I Don't Feel Safe Wearing a Face Mask." And this is from early April. And we've obviously seen things escalate. And Black bodies like his are often caught in a double bind. If he does not wear one, he and his community are at increased risk from disease. And if he does wear one, he is at risk of violence and potentially even death. Mask wearing is a privilege on many levels. There's still much to be said about how we use masks to face dangers, so to speak, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to start opening up that dialogue. Thank you.
Alison, thank you so much for the fantastic presentation. And we have some questions, comments here. Yes, Heather Aku. Maybe you're already aware of this, Alison, but at the Smithsonian, they have a set of hoods that were worn by men arrested for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln.
Okay. Oh, no, I didn't know that. Thank you.
Okay. And wow, yes, some comments here mostly, so you can actually have a look and just see. I wonder, yes, Lainey, I wonder, Alison, if you have watched the recent series, The Watchmen, all-masked task force solving crimes led by Regina King. It's a clever series and begins with a Black man who adopts a mask to avenge racist wrongdoing.
Interesting. No, I haven't seen that either. There's still a lot of catching up I obviously have to do, of course. Yeah. I mean, I'm just starting to, I was just looking at the specific, what was kind of conserved by crime museums and police museums, sort of as evidence that was often used in trials. And so the material, I was starting with the material record, but then going to the trial records and kind of still broadening from there and learning more about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is, dual executioners also conceal their faces, and prisoners in jails, ironically, would also be forced to wear masks when exercising in the yard.
They're really a great book in the Object Lessons Theory series called The Hood that talks about some of the kind of incredibly complex meanings and symbolism of the hooded head.
Do we have any live comments or questions? So let's see if there are any hands up, raised. Quite a lot of comments in our Zoom box though. So, okay. Well, yeah, right. So, yes, Alison, just have a look later probably in this chat, because there are some comments from,
Sure. Well, I see Claire's on the silk crepe. Yeah, they usually specify if it's silk actually, because crepe usually did tend to be wool. I'll double check, but they'll say, one of the other interesting things that I've noticed too is that they often, again in the trials, this is because they're trial transcripts, people are kind of observing whether, like, I can't identify this person. They were wearing this, but the crepe, but they pulled it away from their face so I could see them, and sometimes they're not sure actually if the suspect is wearing a black crepe or whether they've blacked their faces as well with like lamp black with other substances. So there's some really just interesting things to explore there, and problematic things.
Thank you, Alison. Quick comment from Yana. Yana Milkumova-Reynolds.
Oh God, I should probably, can you hear me though?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, because I know that my internet is not great. No, thank you so much, Alison. That was really, really fascinating. I mean, the whole idea of mask privilege, I think, is just so important. I keep thinking of the current situation as a carnivalesque situation, which is something that I put up in another comment earlier. And I can't help thinking that, of course, if we think of the carnivalesque body, it is the body whose orifices are open, and the mask is a device for sealing this dangerous orifice, isn't it? For kind of making this body bounded, for decarnivalizing it again. So I was just thinking about it in terms of danger and kind of eliminating this danger.
Yeah, the mask and masquerade. Thank you for that. That's a really interesting point.